So we also enhanced, we got some content from the console team, and some of that content worked on the iPad, a lot of it didn't. So we had to do a lot of modifications to models, character models, to make them work on the iPad. One of the things that we found is that one of the mistakes that we're going to talk about later is that the operating system for iPhone, as you probably know, is pretty much the same for the iPad. And you might think, well, it's an iPhone with a bigger screen. And if you make that assumption, you're absolutely wrong when it comes down to it. It's a big screen, and of course the user is going to expect that it looks a hell of a lot better, pardon my French, than the iPhone does. But you're still dealing with a processor that really can't push that kind of screen real estate. So we had to do a lot of tricks in order to make that work. The other thing that was a positive is that it was a pretty well managed project. By the way, this feedback is from everybody on the team. This is not from producers. It is from producers, of course, but it's from everybody who worked on this project, including Koolhaus. That's one of the cool things about the CSA process is it gathers information from absolutely everyone. And so these are all comments from everybody on the team. We had very little overtime. There were a couple of milestones, basically, where we had some build issues and some build drop issues, but there's very little overtime on this project. So a positive was that it was very well managed. And also, because we come up with a hit game and the working relationship with the publisher was positive throughout the whole thing, the relationship, obviously, you build that relationship with your publishing partner, which is very important for future projects. We had a new control scheme that we had to come up with, and it worked out very well. Obviously, this was a risk because we didn't have any precedents for this. We had an iPhone code base that was being developed by another developer, and we had to use some of that for the game. And there was issues with pipeline, but we managed to deal with those issues fairly well. And it didn't really affect the schedule when it came down to it, so we're happy about that. We had a very dedicated team, a team that overcame a lot of issues, worked together very hard in a very positive way. I have to say at Koolhaus we don't have what some companies have, which I definitely saw in previous companies where I worked, where there is communication problems between artists and programmers and designers and sound people. We didn't really have that. We don't have that at Koolhaus. It was one of the reasons why this project went as smooth as it did. Our build, our iPad version, was much more stable code base than the iPhone version was. And I'm also happy to say that the iPad got way better reviews and better sales than the iPhone version. So we're extremely happy about all those things. Solid, well-executed project. So those are the good things. And as Jason De La Rocca yesterday said, you need to fail in order to learn. And we learn a lot more from our failures than we do from our successes. But you need to also take a look at your successes and celebrate those successes. And feel good about those things, and also look for ways to improve those successes, improve on those. And the cool thing about the CSA process is it does look at all aspects of working on a project, but the overall goal at the end is to come up with those solutions so that the next time you work on a project, it'll be even better than the one you just worked on. So we're going to take a look at what went wrong. We're going to talk about some of the warts today when it comes down to it. So first and foremost, the platform is something that was basically unknown. We really didn't know what the real risks were. We couldn't say, ABC. We could say some of those, such as the screen real estate. Does the CPU really support that? We really didn't know. And on top of that, we really didn't have the hardware in our hands until 6 weeks into the project. And EA didn't know either because they didn't have any hardware either. So their tech people couldn't tell us, hey, watch out for this, watch out for that. It was really an unknown. And so we're diving into this thing. We're working with emulators. And emulators are one thing. If you ever work with emulators, once you transition onto the hardware, quite often it's very different. And we found that as well in this particular case. So when we worked on Vintage Voltage, which was later in the project, we decided to go with our own code from scratch. And in hindsight, it might have been better to take some of the code from the game use some of that code in Vintage Voltage as opposed to just doing it all from scratch. That was one of the things that we look back on and say, perhaps we should have taken that particular slant. The front-end design for Vintage Voltage was a real struggle. We came up with a front-end and UI design that EA approved. But we talked about, well, you know, it's close, but we all felt that it could be better. But heck, EA approved it, let's just move on. Well, later on, about 2 months later, we found out that, well, not everybody at EA had seen the front-end UI, and they had the same concerns that we did. In hindsight, and this is a solution from this, is we should have gone with our gut, and we should have gone and pressed EA and said, hey, you know what? Yes, we know time's tight, we're trying to get this game out, but we're not happy with the UI. And we should have really pushed EA a lot harder on this instead of just saying, okay, they signed off on it, let's move on. So that's a solution to that particular issue. There were code drop issues, uploading to EA's source control. That was sometimes very painful, and that, for the most part, caused the overtime that we had. And luckily, it wasn't a lot, but it could have been done better. There could have been better communication with EA. We had a lot of iterations on the front-end design, too many, just going back to that for a second. We also underestimated the time that multiplayer would take, as well as memory issues. The code that we adopted had some issues with regards to dumping out the garbage. Those of your programmers know what I'm talking about, of where basically errors in code start filling up, and it causes memory to fill up, you got memory leaks happening, and suddenly your game crashes after about 15 plays. Or going in and out of the game, for example, from other apps on the iPad. We underestimated the time it took to test multiplayer, and also what it would take to deal with those memory issues. Next, more iPads in the studio. That was something that was very difficult because there weren't any to get. It's just one of those things externally that you have no control over. I suppose we could have said, okay, well, we won't start the project until later, but ship dates are ship dates, and they are critical from a publisher perspective to have games out at a certain time. And we understand that, but it did present some issues. Our build process itself could have been a lot better. It was slow, it was inefficient, and also the communication about the build process with the rest of the team could have been better as well. We struggled with the art style for Vintage Voltage, especially the front end. And too many iterations, too much back and forth. It really needed a lot earlier sign-off on that particular product. There were some late nights, as I mentioned. At Koolhaus, we have people who have families. I have a family. Crunch. How many of you work Crunch? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. The IGDA has a whole booklet on Crunch that you can get off their website. Talks about the industry with respect to overtime. And we really want to make great games Monday to Friday, 40 hours a week. And we don't like Crunch because we feel Crunch is counterproductive. It affects creativity, it affects innovation, and that's not what we're about. So even though we had very minimal overtime, and really couldn't call it Crunch, we still look at that and say, where could we have done better? And so hence this is on the list of things that we could have done better. We had a lot of issues with the input source code issues on the existing code that we adopted. And we didn't allocate enough time to analyze that section of the code, reverse engineer it. When you're coding on a project to begin with, you don't get the luxury of having a lot of time to go through every second nook and cranny of that particular code base. That's one of the problems when you're doing a so-called port. When you're building your own code, you have your own engine, you're very familiar with that code base, and you know what the issues are, and you can get around them. But when you are coding on a project where you're adopting a code base, even though you've worked with it, there are still issues that are down there under the hood, and these were one of those that definitely caught us a bit. And as I mentioned, there's not enough time for multiplayer testing, actual gameplay testing, that we allocated to the project to begin with. There were some character pipeline issues. The whole code base on the character pipeline side of things was a bit of a mystery. Documentation was poor. EA really helped a lot. Really thankful to the technical people at EA, especially one of the technical directors that we worked there, Brian. They were super helpful. They tried everything they could, but there was not a lot of documentation on that pipeline. So it's extremely important, all of you programmers out there, I know you're trying to get your code done and trying to get that milestone shipped, but it's super important to document your header files. It's super, super important to take the time so somebody else can understand it. And that's a critical thing. You may understand your comments, but somebody else has to read that down the line. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how that character pipeline was working. And remember now we're pushing with the larger screen, the characters are up there, they've got a whole bunch of flaws that you didn't see on the iPhone version or a mobile version, even the DS version. And now because it's amplified, we had to change the characters, make them better looking, and that means that the whole character pipeline is going to start struggling if it can't adapt to that particular larger modeling. There were issues with the existing graphics system, coupled with the character pipeline. That was something that really was a problem as well, and caused a lot of delays in the schedule. There's a dependency on the networking aspect of this game. There was a team at EA that was working on the networking of this, and whenever you've got dependencies that are outside of your control, whether they are subcontractors or whether they're another developer where you're getting a code base, or whether it's a publisher where they're developing something internally, you have to make sure that you account in the schedule for those potential problems. If there's delays with those dependencies, this is going to cause delays for you. And that was one of the things that we underestimated going along. We overscoped on those external dependencies, and it really was probably one of the most problems in the project. There are some issues with the font conversion pipeline, understanding it. Again, not enough time at the beginning to take a look at that and analyze that pipeline. And one of the things that we felt, even though this game is reviewed really well, we're always wanting to push the envelope. We're extremely proud of Vintage Voltage. And there are some other cool features in the game, but we felt that we could have come up with even better features yet. And we hope we can get a shot at the next version of Madden NFL iPad that we can implement those, because we have a lot of ideas how to make the game even better. And lastly, the build machine was an issue. It came on late for various reasons, and it did cause some problems. So there you have the warts. And as I mentioned, the most important goal of failure is to learn from those mistakes and to come up with solutions to those. So the cool thing about the CSA process is that it allows every single person on the project to give feedback and give their ideas on how to fix those particular problems. Making games is a very complex enterprise. Long gone is the day where one person can make a game. It really is. Even on smaller games like for iPhone and so on and so forth, it's very difficult for one person to do everything. Next to impossible. And when it comes down to it, there's really no one person who knows everything about making games. There's an expert in art, there's an expert in code, there's an expert in design, an expert in sound. And really, the experts are the individuals working on, each individual working on the project. Whether it's the physics programmer or the AI programmer, or whether it's the game designers, or whether it's the modelers or animators, each one of those individuals are the experts, and the solutions need to come from those particular people. Okay? And so in the CSA process, we want to hear from everybody. We want to hear what your ideas are on how to fix these particular issues.